Hi guys, and welcome to the first tutorial. Yay! So first things first, we're actually going to talk about wings and wing anatomy and bird anatomy in general, as well as like theoretical angel anatomy and what you need to know to make a pair of wings first. If you guys don't understand anatomy before you go into this, your wings aren't going to look right, and you may not know why because they have feathers on them and they're roughly the right shape. But if you guys don't have the proportions right, they're just going to come out looking weird. So we're going to talk about that first, and then we're going to go into how to create your sketch, your full-size sketch for your wings before you start making anything. And that way everything's proportioned correctly when the final costume is done.
So first off, I want to talk about how a human arm and a bird wing are similar. In fact, they, in terms of the bones, are pretty much the same thing. This picture by Uzlo on DeviantArt really shows that really well. If you look at a chicken wing, it's basically the same bone structure as our hand. It's just the bones are a little bit different proportioned. But when I talk about a wing, I'm going to talk about, the bicep or the shoulder or the elbow or the wrist or the hand or the forearm, and we're going to basically talk about it like it's a human arm because when we're making it, it's a lot easier than, I don't know, saying the scientific name of things. And they function in exactly the same way. So it makes it really easy if you move your arms around, like that's how a bird moves its wings. He also has really good demonstrations of the different feathers on the wing, both front and back, and I definitely recommend checking out his work. Again, the link is going to be uh, in the description, and you should definitely make sure that when you're designing your wings, you check out this or something else that shows you the different parts of the wing, both open and closed. It's definitely an important part of design. So the next thing I want to talk about is how wings tend to fan. And the more you fan, the more stylistic it's going to look, like in this shot of some Firebird wings I made. Now, these are fanned a lot, but it really demonstrates how the wings fan from the wrist and they fan from the elbow. So real bird wings don't tend to fan quite that drastically, but the same rule applies. They fan from the wrist joint and they fan pretty much from the elbow joint. And you want to keep this in mind whenever you're placing your feathers, regardless of how stylistic it is. So when a bird wing is fully open, especially on the downbeat, you'll notice that it's almost a perfect fan the whole way around. You don't see like a separate fan from the wrist and a separate fan from the elbow. Now, depending on how, again, stylistic you want to be, if you want them to look super realistic, when they're fully open, you're going to want them to have this smooth, solid arc. But, if you're going for a more angelic or beautiful design or stylistic design, you might want to give it just a little bit more arc. The more folded your wing becomes, the more you're going to notice this arc in the wing, regardless of whether it's stylistic or it's realistic. Even when the wing is folded, you'll notice that the arcs still apply, even though you have all the feathers that were spread out now condensed and overlapping, you still find these arcs present in the wing. And while they are less apparent, you still want to take note of them and display them in your own wing. So here I have a folded set that I did, and as you can see, the arc itself in, especially the primaries and secondaries, is pretty minimal. But then I increase that arc in the second and third layer, and it looks really beautiful and realistic because that's how a wing actually folds. And even though on a real bird you might not notice it as much, it's still there, and the eye picks up on that detail and realizes that this is a folded fanning wing. Again, how much arc you decide to put in really depends on your design. Like in these images, the angel wings are rather stylistic, and so they have just a ton of arc, but the effect is really quite beautiful. So it kind of depends on how fantastical your wing is and how much your wing is folded. The more folded it is, the more you're going to notice the arc, and if it's straight out, maybe you want less. Lastly, I want to talk about proportion of the feathers. So you can see the primaries and the secondaries are about 2 to 3 times as long as the primary coverts. And you want to try and maintain this proportion when you create your wing, whether it's an articulating or a static set. Now, in static sets, this is a little harder to do, especially if you're working with all feather. Again, creating that fan kind of helps create that effect, and you're gluing together multiple feathers to create quote unquote longer feathers when you're working with turkey is a way to accomplish this as well. But for the most part, especially if you're making fake feathers anyway, you want to make sure that you make those fake feathers about 2 to 3 times as long as your next layer. I also use goose shoulder feather on the very tops of the wings to maintain that proportion. So I go from a long fake feather to a moderately sized turkey feather, and then lastly to a very small goose shoulder feather, and this helps maintain the proportion of a real wing. Now, how you design your wing also kind of depends on what you're going for. If you're going for like a cute finch wing, it's going to be more rounded and adorable and smaller in proportion to your body. But if you're, say, going for like a seagull wing, they're going to be super elongated and huge in proportion to your body. Same with hawks. Hawks are going to be more rounded, but they're going to be ginormous because they're gliders. So your design is going to hinge partially on what kind of bird you're going for.
Okay, so now that you understand anatomy, we can move on to actually making your design. So depending on the size of your articulating set, you're going to have to proportion everything off of it specifically. And you may have to change the design just a little bit so that you can fit it underneath that frame, but overall it moves. If you're doing a static set, you can have a little more artistic freedom. You can definitely, like if it has like that curved shape when it comes up or something, if you want a folded set, you can definitely get all those curves in there. Right now, I am working on a Hawk Girl articulating set for myself for once. And there are some compromises that I'm making. So a lot of the pictures show her wings come up and they're curved, and they come up pretty high and then they drop down pretty low, and then when she spreads them they really don't open up too much on the side, and then she either has really long primaries or they're very fluffy and messy. I definitely like them longer, so I'm gonna go with that kind of version of the wings. I think they look more proportional and more realistic. So I'm gonna do that, but it does kind of present the problem that when it's folded up, like I want it, it's gonna start up about here and then it has to go to about my calf. And that's about, I already measured about 3.5, 4 feet-ish. 4 feet's kind of getting it low. I won't be able to sit. I don't think I'm gonna be able to sit anyway. But, so because of that, you know, the wings are gonna be just stupid huge. And so, and like this part of the wing has to be longer than it can be in the shows because she, you know, it stays short and these actually expand. So that's going to be a little different, but they'll look good closed and they'll look good open. That just, they're going to be a little big when open. So I've already sketched out the framework on to my paper. I don't know, yeah, you can see in the shot that I have the metal pieces already cut out. You don't need the metal pieces, you can just go based on the measurements that I will provide eventually for the different frameworks depending on the size, your rough eventual size. The size I am going for is about a 12-foot wingspan. It might end up being about 13 feet because I'm doing such long primary feathers so that I get that length at the top. So I started out by sketching it like most, there's not enough space, I have to lie down. They're gonna be mostly open. So instead of being all the way straight, I'm gonna have them end kind of there. Sit-ups! So I'm not gonna have them open like all the way up like I usually do. They're gonna be kind of half closed. So I've drawn it half closed because that's where I want it to end. If you want it to end all the way open, draw it all the way open so that you get the shape correct, because that's where it's gonna stop. So if it doesn't look good where it's gonna stop, then it's just not gonna look good. So, yeah, let's get a sketching. So I have the basic framework down, but there is a sleeve that goes over the top, and it can't kind of go straight into the crease because when it folds it'll jam it up a little bit, so it does have to kind of smooth out at the top. I don't think you can see my red on here, so I'm going to re-sketch the framework. I use different colors for different things. I usually start light with my sketch to kind of get the rough shape, and then I move on to darker colors once I actually get things down. I'm gonna end up probably doing only darker colors so that you guys can see it, which means it's gonna look kind of sketchy. But yeah, that way at least you guys can see it. So it's gonna look messier than it normally does, but sorry. So on your framework, you're going to want to mark where the holes are going to go and how many holes you're going to have for your feathers. Each feather has its own individual hole and pivot. So you need to kind of mark the lines where they're going to go. And that, I mean, it's going to probably change when you do your final framework, and you can get, it doesn't have to be perfect like right now. You just need to get the right number of feathers on there. And you definitely want to start under the assumption each feather is going to have a wire that goes straight from each of these points. So start, like, I draw out the frame and then I put down each of the feather points. So typically there are like 25, 23 on smaller sets, like 8-foot sets, you might only have 20 feathers. But you'll find out when you go through this, you know, your feathers can only be about this thick, maybe a little thicker. And you don't want to make them too thick or they're going to be super floppy. If you make them too thin, you're going to have 8,000 of them and you don't do that. So 20 to 25 is like the magic number. If you do like a 6-foot set, you can do 18, you know. But, you know, try and measure out and do about that many feathers inside your frame. And then I'm going to draw lines, and then I'm going to draw the feathers around them to this shape. So. Keeping in mind your first feather is going to need 2 holes. So you're right at the very tip of your frame, you're going to have 1 hole that basically just holds that feather straight. And you'll see why later. Okay, so as predicted, I have about 23 feathers for a 12-foot wingspan. Shoot. See if you can see this here. So yeah. Probably messed up everything now. Somewhere in there? So this is where that measurement from the top of the shoulder to my calf comes into play. From the wrist joint out is that measurement, because if you are only 5 feet tall like me and you make it 6 feet long, you're not going to be able to walk. So it's very important to make sure that you know that measurement for sure, and you know where the frame is going to hit when you put it on your back. The frames I do tend to be around ear height, so I know that. It might be easier for you guys to make the frame first, and if you're not as concerned with shape. make the frame first and then see where it sits and then make all your measurements. But I like to do sketches first because that way it looks right at the end. What I'm gonna do is put a mark out here, and that's pretty much how big my wings are gonna be at the end. So after you draw the lines, I kind of start sketching out the top feathers to start. And then after that, I basically look at the basic shape of my reference image, and then I tend to draw a curve. I'll draw it, oh, this is gonna be this jankiest sketch ever. I draw a curve that mimics the rough shape of the wing, so that I can then follow with all of my subsequent feathers and make them kind of match up. And they don't always look perfect once matched up. I need to move this over, huh? They don't always look perfect when you match up with the line, and you probably will have to make adjustments after that. Again, start with lighter colors and then work your way to the darker colors. I just want you guys to be able to see everything I'm doing, so this is, again, going to be kind of a sketchy sketch, but it gives you the idea. So wings again, remember, curve and fan kind of from the wrist, and then they fan again from the elbow. So based on that, I kind of have this curve here that comes from the wrist, and then starting again from kind of like a fan from the elbow, I do another curve that goes down over that way underneath the elbow. And so that gives you that nice wing shape. If it's all the way open, you're probably not, depending, if you're doing a stylistic version, sometimes all the way open, you'll still give it that little whoop. But usually when a wing is like all the way straight open, it's gonna have like a straight curve and not as much of like the two fans. It will in terms of when you're doing more of a feather design, but it won't in terms of the arc underneath. So that's actually going to be like a straight curve. When you, but again, like it depends on what you want the final look to be. I'm having mine stop. You remember, it's not going to go all the way straight. They're going to stop a little bit bent. And so because of that, I'm making sure to give myself some good loops in there so that it looks right when it's all the way open. So now that I have like a rough design figured out, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm not gonna bother with the middle section right now. I'm gonna assume that the bars are roughly in the spots where they're gonna be, but I am gonna go, just to finish off the design and make sure that it looks perfect, I'm gonna go in with my darkest color and finalize all of the shapes and sizes of each of the feathers. Okay, again, this sketch doesn't quite show each of the feathers. I have too many lines on here that are very dark. Again, normally I color code. I tend to do the barbs in red and I then leave them, because otherwise the sketch tends to get too many lines on it and you can't tell where anything is or what anything is. These are all kind of in one color, but it does show the shape right. And if you're working with a frame, like a static frame, this is perfectly sufficient because you're not typically going to be worried about the articulation of the feathers, so it's not as big a deal. But for this one, there's so many lines on here. But yeah, like I typically go back in and draw out each feather and the lines, but there's just too much going on here. So I don't want to mess it up. But as you can see, like we have each of our feathers planned out, and when we go to the next step where we're going to make each of these feathers out of fabric and glue and wire, we can measure each of the wires out based on these wire lines, which I normally would have in red, and the fabric then would be what I have in black. And we'll go over that in the next tutorial. So I'll just give you a quick look at the sketch one more time, and yeah, hopefully that helps you guys design your next wing project. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. See you guys later.